Right, it is noon, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda Pasick, and I am Associate Director for Digital Marketing here at Selby Gardens. And we have a great presentation for you by Vice President for Regional History, John McCarthy, and it's Treasures of the Historic Spanish Point Campus, White Cottage. We will have opportunities for questions. If you'd like to put your questions in the chat, we will get to those at 2 points in the presentation today. And without further ado, I will hand it over to John McCarthy.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today for this presentation. And I want to extend a thank you to Jennifer Romanecki, our President and CEO, for inviting me to do this series this spring. And today is the fourth in our series. And I thought it would be interesting to explore the history of White Cottage. As with all the programs that we do, we get images from many different sources, and I like to always credit those on the title slide. So this year, beginning in January, we've done Treasures of the Historic Spanish Point Campus. We started with the Gupto House in the Boatyard. We moved on to the Webb Packing House. Last month, we did Mary's Chapel, and today we're going to talk about White Cottage. Next month, we're going to kind of take care of all the little bits and pieces. I'm calling this one Gems and Jewels to go along with that Treasures title. And we'll talk about things like the aqueduct and windows to the past and some of the garden urns and just the little things that make the campus so special that we haven't talked about in these other presentations. So look forward to that next month, and that will wrap up this particular series. And then we'll do a little special summer series this year as well. So today's program is in three sections. White Cottage celebrates 140 years this year. It's 140 years old. And during that time, it's had a lot of different roles on the property. And so we're going to talk about how it started out as a home, a residence, and then it shifted to become part of the Webb's Winter Resort, and they called it the dormitory. Then we're going to talk about Bertha Palmer's arrival and how she spiced it up a little bit and how she utilized the property and her family as well, all through the 1930s and 40s and 50s and through that era. And then we'll get into the modern era of how the building was restored for modern use as really the largest building on the historic Spanish Point campus. So we'll get started with the residence and the dormitory. And, here's the White Cottage that we all know and love. And of course, it's the headquarters for our Bayside Cafe. It's also the, comfort station for the campus. And we have our offices upstairs and the bride's room there overlooking the bay and the White Cottage lawn. And it's quite the rambling structure. It's quite large. It has wings going off in all directions. And we're going to get into the early history, and we're going to see that it wasn't always such large and rambling as it is today. So this is the oldest photograph that I could find of the White Cottage. And this is back when it was Jack and Emma's house. Jack was one of the sons of John Webb, and his father deeded him the property to build the home after he and Emma had gotten married. And so this was designed as their home. And in this particular photograph, so this is an interesting photograph. On the one hand, it's the oldest photograph that we have of White Cottage. It's also a very unique photograph, having been taken from out on the shoal sandbar, looking toward the point. And while it's very poor quality, it's one of those photos that even though it's poor quality, you're glad to have it because it's the only image like this from the time period. And then, so on the left side, what we see is the original Webb homestead house constructed back in 1867. And then as we move to the right, we see the woods, or what we now have as sunken garden and pergola, and also the White Cottage lawn. But that was all just the woods back then with red cedar trees and the gumbo limbos and a lot of the same things that we see there now, but just more of it. And then you see one of the two docks that extended from the south side of the point. And we believe that this is the 10-ton schooner Vision that Frank Guptill and William Webb built, that they used for years to haul all the agricultural products to market. And we believe on the right-hand side of the dock, looking at it from this image, is probably the schooner, the Phantom. And then between the two masts of the ships, you can see this very square, um, kind of federal style building with a pyramid shaped roof, and then a widow's walk up at the top where they could go up through the roof and stand up on the roof and look out at all the landscape and waterscape in all directions. So a little bit closer makes it a little bit grainier, but you can see at this point that it is just a square building, 2 stories in height, with the widow's walk on top and perched, of course, up on top of the shell mound. And this is a photograph taken years later, but shows it in more detail. So I've inserted it here. We know that this is after 1896 because you see the little sitting room addition to the left that John Webb added on to the building in 1896. But here you get to see a little bit of the detail of the widow's walk up at the top, the little observatory up there. You also can see the windows. They were what's called a 6/1. So it had 6 panes of glass on the upper portion of the double hung window, and then a single pane of glass on the lower portion. You can also see the porch out front, looking out over the bay. And if you're familiar with the little square porch that's the entrance to the cafe now, this is much smaller than that, both in width as well as in depth away from the building. But also, I think this is kind of cool. You can see some decorative trim around the eave of the porch, and then the crisscross railing of the porch itself. And also, I think of interest is that when you look at the building now, everything's been reversed on this facade, where the door is in the middle is a window on the first floor, and where the windows are doors on the first floor, and then above where the windows are now doors, and then the opening where that door is, there is no opening there anymore. So a lot of changes have taken place with this building. And before we leave this particular photograph, I want to point out all the Spanish bayonets growing on the edge of the mound. So at the bottom of the photograph, we can see kind of the shell that's kind of washed with every high tide that comes into the site. And you see this just tremendous growth of Spanish bayonets, which the family described, was in abundance when they first moved to the area. And then the vegetation that we're seeing looks a lot like red cedar trees. So it's kind of cool to see some of the same vegetation back there then that we have now. And this is another photograph of the building back before any changes were made to it. And again, you can see the windows and you can see the porch railing here. This happens to be Mabel Webb. She was the granddaughter of John Webb. She was the little girl that was born the day that the bell arrived for Mary's Chapel. She's got quite a nice smile on her face here. So again, the porch on the building was much smaller than the porches today. And where the upstairs porch is the room that we use as the bride's room today. And it's much larger. It's almost the entire width of this part of the building. And then it comes out about twice as far from the building toward the bay itself. You can see that it's a simple clapboard style construction on the exterior, and it is all painted freshly white. This would have been the typical color to paint a building in Florida was white because it helped to reflect the sun, keep it cool. It was also a very commonly available paint color. And, this is what was done with most homes. So I wanted to kind of put White Cottage on its proper pedestal as being one of the oldest surviving buildings in Sarasota County. For years and years, it kind of had the rank of being the second oldest building, following only the Alfred Bidwell Luke Wood House, which is maintained by the Historical Society of Sarasota and was built 2 years earlier than White Cottage. But subsequently and more recently, a family restoring a home near Cunliffe Lane, near Sarasota's Bayfront, has actually discovered that the building that they own has components to it that were from 1876. So that has kind of become Sarasota's oldest home, even though it was expanded in the 1880s. And so it doesn't look exactly like it looked originally. But indeed, the old material appears to be there. And so they kind of take the #1 ranking. The Historical Society's Bidwell Wood House takes second place. And then Jack's House or White Cottage takes third place we believe construction started in 1884 and then was completed in 1885. And people are always asking me, well, some stuff says it was built in 84 and some stuff says it was built in 85. Well, I think that the reality is it was started in 84 and completed in 85. And then the next oldest building in Sarasota is actually a church building. It was the second sanctuary for the Friendship Baptist Church, which was based in the Bee Ridge and Fruitville area. And this little church that was built in 1886 is over off of Bay Vista and Ponder in the Fruitville community. And so that's the fourth oldest house. And the fifth oldest house that we're aware of is the Curry House down in Nokomis. And then 1 year younger than that is the Tatum Rawls house, which used to be in Fruitville and was, or what they called the Bee Ridge area, and moved out to Mayaca. And then I included some other kind of buildings that are known as historical homes here. Once you get into the 1890s, there are actually more homes than what are on this list. But the Lord Heigl House down in the Venice area that has been relocated and restored and is over behind City Hall. That was built in 1896. Reminding you about our first program of the season, the Guptill House was built in 1901. And then the Hermitage, the core building there for the Hermitage Artist Retreat on Manasota Key was built in 1907. And that was one of the first, well, it's certainly the oldest building on a barrier island in Sarasota County at this time. So this just kind of places White Cottage where it needs to be, third oldest building in Sarasota. And that's quite a distinction, I think. And then here's a nice shot that was taken back in 2007, an aerial view showing Webb's Cove, that little enclosed bay area on the north side, showing the restored footbridge, also the sunken garden and pergola, and then White Cottage right here in the middle, appearing to be the large rambling structure that we know it as today. And as I mentioned, quite a bit larger than it started out. This is one of the planning documents that was used in the early days of Spanish Point to identify all the historical resources and information about that. And so again, thinking back to that very first photograph that I showed, on the left, you see the original Webb Homestead house. You also see the detached kitchen and an early addition that they made to that house. So here, if you can see my cursor, here's the original homestead house that was built in 1867. Here's the original detached kitchen. And then this is what they called the annex. This is an expansion that they did that kind of bridged the gap between the kitchen and the house. You'll see this is the south side dock that we saw the Vision and we believe the Phantom tied up to in that old photograph. Up on the north side, you see they actually had a dock up on the north side as well. This one didn't go into the deep water channel that you have on the south side. It went up into more shallow water. And then you see where we have the mangroves today, where the path to the footbridge goes right through the mangrove swamp. There were no mangroves back in the early days because a hard freeze in 1868, the family said killed all the mangroves. So that was like an open beach. And that's kind of hard for us to picture today. Also, you can see what's called the Spang excavation and well, and it's pointing to a site over here. That's what we now call Window to the Past. That hole was dug to provide a well for Mr. Norman Spang, who was one of the visitors that came to the site. He came from Pittsburgh, and he ended up buying property from Webb, and his house was down here as well. And then you can see the privy. This was the outdoor plumbing, if you will. And this was a three-holer, which was a pretty fancy privy for the day, but they did have the guests at the home and things like that. And then you see Jack Webb House. I like to call it the Jack and Emma Webb House. And in this particular case, you see it with the original porch, the 1896 addition to the left that John Webb added. And then you also see a little porch on the back, which was on top of a brick cistern. So anyway, there's a lot to be seen there. And I thought this might help in understanding the changes that have occurred to White Cottage over time. And so the original structure, 1885, is this core piece. This includes the little cafe kitchen, the cafe welcome area, the big main room, the restrooms, and then upstairs, the offices. And then you see to the left, 1896, this was the little sitting room addition that John Webb built onto the building. And then in the Palmer family in the 1930s, substantially enhanced the size of the building. They added the sunroom in the back. They expanded the porches on the front and enclosed the upper portion, and then built this entire wing here. This was a master bedroom suite that was constructed over a carport. And so these were the major changes that occurred in 1930. But I should also mention that it appears that the entire building was put up on a brick and concrete block foundation. So the original foundation probably was pine logs and driven into the ground. And the Palmer family, knowing that they were going to do all these improvements and enhancements, probably wanted to give it a better foundation. And so they did that. And so they probably lifted the building up a little bit to get that new foundation underneath it, and then did all these other additions to it. And so we can see those additions here. So we can see the bride's room up here. This is much, much larger than the original porch. Same with down below. And then this entire master bedroom suite cantilevered out over the carport. And today there are these columns down here that render it to be quite an awkward carport. But in reality, those were not there in the 1930s. Those were added later, which we'll see later in the program. And then a view from the backside, where this little room here, I believe, is where the original porch was, over a brick cistern. And I do not believe that these are the brick walls of the cistern. I believe that the brick walls of the cistern are kind of inside this, and that they did this around the outside. And here again, you can see the additional room here. You can see the original window openings here, and the columns that were added years later in the middle of the carport for concerns of supporting that large room up here. And then this just kind of helps you to visualize, this is kind of defining the original 1884, 1885, the core of the building. Because oftentimes people will ask me right down at this location, well, what part of it is original? And I say, it's just that square part in the middle is what's absolutely original. Now, one of the the whole idea of this evolving from a home to resort was part of the original Webb's Winter Resort, which this is a view from the White Cottage looking out toward the original homestead house on the left, as we saw in the first photograph, and then the kitchen addition and the annex. And then you can see the little Webb's Cove over here. You can see their cold storage area down here with a little roof over. And this was concrete. This is where they would keep all their vegetables and preserves and things like that. You see Casey Key in the background. And the very first year that the Webbs were here, they entertained a guest, someone that they knew from the north, and he came down, and that was Colonel Ezekiel Jewett, and he would come down almost every year. And he had ties to the Smithsonian Institution, and he is who had introduced John Webb to Joseph Henry, the first director of the Smithsonian Institution. And when John Webb had found the human remains while he was digging to create the farm, and Jewett connected him up to Joseph Henry, and that started this long-term relationship between the Webb family and the resort and the Smithsonian Institution. This is the very first or earliest page that we have for the hotel register that they kept. And so this is 1871. This is 4 years after Jewett visited the first time. And you have the Case family who came down from Syracuse, New York. Syracuse and Utica, where the Webb family came from, are only about a half hour away from one another. And then you have Colonel Jewett signed in. So in 1871, they basically had 3 guests at the resort. They're just kind of getting started with that. John Webb became quite well known both here in this part of Florida as well as back home in New York for what he was doing down here. And he went to Hamilton College, and this is a quote from the Hamilton College Literary Monthly from September of 1879. And I think it's just a great quote. It says, John G. Webb, class of 44, formerly a druggist in Utica, is now settled at Manatee, Florida, and is one of the most active and highly respected citizens of the Gulf Coast. He is now chairman of the Board of County Commissioners, and an excellent one. Beginning miles away from any settlers 12 years ago with a large family and very little money, he has literally hewed out his fortune. So that gives us a little sense of what they were thinking back home in New York. But this article is from a book that was published in 1884 that has a couple of chapters in it about hunting and fishing and the Myakka River and the coastline. And this gentleman made arrangements with John Webb to come down and stay at the resort. And he was really delighted that he had made this choice. And he said, we'd arrived at the home of Mr. Webb, and we were given a most cordial greeting, although we were entire strangers to the family. Such kind and hospitable treatment as we received, and such a clean, wholesome, palatable dinner as we were treated to that night made us glad in our hearts that we had had the good fortune to be directed to and finally to reach the home of these kind-hearted people. Then he goes on to say that they're natives of Utica, New York, and also talks about having a large tract, comfortable farmhouse, and ample outbuildings. And then he says he's choosing as his residence one of the most romantic and beautiful sites, talking about up on the Indian Mound. Now, the advent of more and more visitors to the resort caused John Webb to start thinking about setting up a post office there. And I wanted to include this today because we often talk about White Cottage as being the home of the Osprey Post Office. And I don't think it was the first home. I think the first home of the Osprey Post Office was probably in John Webb's primary residence there, which was functioning as a resort in 1884 when he finally got the post office approved. But he applied for the post office back in 1881. And here's the actual documentation that came back to him. It's really an application for the post office. So he had written to the Postmaster General and said that he wanted to create a post office at his little village, which he was calling Little Sarasota. And you can see here that when the postmaster assigned in this particular case, the assistant postmaster sent this back to John Webb, he references this is associated with your application for a post office at Little Sarasota. Now, a lot of people talk about, they say, well, and for years they've said that, well, he wanted to call it the post office Spanish Point, but the Postal Service would not allow a two-word name, and so he called it Osprey. But the reality is that he wanted to call it Little Sarasota. And he was situated on Little Sarasota Bay. He was looking out at Little Sarasota Key, what we now call Siesta Key. And Sarasota was starting to hustle and bustle, and so he wanted to be associated with that as well. But the post office felt that that sounded a little bit too much like another town. And they actually, if you look down below, you can see these little hands that are pointing toward a note. And the postmaster makes reference to filling out this form the way you're instructed to. It says, select a short name for the proposed office, which when written will not resemble the name of any other post office in the United States. So Little Sarasota was a little too close to Sarasota. And Webb's interpretation of this was, I need a one-word name, and came up with Osprey for the fish hawk that was flying back then, catching fish, and we see him flying almost every day. I think this is also significant, this post office application, because it talks about how many people had moved into the area. And it also is what named North Creek, because he had to define the boundaries of the town. And one of the boundaries that he listed was North Creek. And so today we have North Creek and South Creek, which are basically the boundaries of Osprey, codified by the post office application. And without spending too much time on this, I also want to add that, and it's kind of important for something I'm going to talk about later, this application that Webb ultimately sent back to the Postal Service was actually filled out by Charles Abbey, the postmaster who was in Sarasota. Webb had kind of not the best handwriting, and I think he asked his friend, the postmaster of Sarasota, to do this for him. And Charles Abbey, the postmaster, actually signs this as a witness. But if you look at the handwriting, all of this handwriting is from Charles Abbey, and it mirrors the exact same handwriting that's on Abbey's application for the 1878 Sarasota post office. Anyway, here's a little map that accompanied the postal application. And off on the left, you can see the Sarasota post office up here. This was Charles Abbey's post office. This was on the northeast corner of what is now Osprey Avenue and Hillview, over toward the hospital. Then you see Philippi Creek running down here. You see a bridge across Philippi Creek. You see a straight line. I'm sure this road was not so straight. It winded through the woods. It was just a sandy trail through the woods. coming down here to Spanish Point, crossing over North Creek, also with the little bridge there. And then you see this road here going out to Pine Level, which was the county seat. And that's essentially State Road 72 heading out to Arcadia. So it's fascinating. You see the date here, March of 1884. It's a fascinating little sketch map that the family had to submit with the postal application. Now, the White Cottage, as we call it today, was actually built originally as a home for Jack and Emma Webb. And Emma was born in Iowa and had moved to Sarasota a couple of years before with her mother and father. Jack Webb was the youngest of the Webb sons, and they had met in Sarasota and fallen in love. And then they actually were married in 1881 in Osprey, and they needed a place to live. So John Webb deeded some land to Jack to build the house, and they went ahead and built the house, and they lived there just for a couple of years because in 1890 they moved to California. And without getting too deep into the story, one of the things that occurred was that Emma Andrews' father had been involved in, well, he'd gotten arrested for helping murder Charles Abbey, John Webb's friend, the Sarasota postmaster. So that created some friction around the community, and Mr. Andrews was found guilty of murder and put into jail at Pine Level, and he escaped after a year and a half and went out to California. And Emma decided to go out to California as well, and Jack went with her. They both went to Stockton, California in 1890, which at that point, the property was given back to John Webb, and it became part of the resort. But just a little bit more about these two, because it really started out as their home. John Walter, as he was called, or Jack, was born in New York in 1857. His occupation, as shown in the census records, once he was out in California, he shows up as a clothing retailer, a jeweler, a watchmaker. Here on the homestead, he helped with the farm. He did all the soliciting out in the other homes and people that needed to sell things, and he'd go out and see if they had chickens or eggs or pigs or vegetables that they wanted to sell, and he'd make all the arrangements for that stuff to go through the packing house and out onto the ships. He also helped with building projects and basically helped with everything around the farm. And then he died in 1936, still in Stockton, California. Emma was born in Iowa in 1863. And in the census, she shows up as a decorative artist working with china or pottery or porcelain. And so she could have, at this point in time, actually been molding it, or she could have been decorating it. There were many examples where china was brought in a plain pattern, and then artists, typically women, would paint on the images that we see as part of that china today. And so that may have been what she was doing. And she lived longer than Jack did. She passed away in 1952, also in Stockton, California. So Jack really never came back to the homestead. And for years, the story was that John Webb was mad at him because he married the woman whose father had murdered one of his friends and that he wasn't welcome back at the property. But I listened to an interview recently where one of the family descendants says that was really not true. The relationship was maintained. There was no ill will beyond maybe some initial friction in the early years. It was just that Jack couldn't afford to come back to this area to visit or otherwise. And so that he couldn't even afford to have his body transported here for burial in the Webb Cemetery. So I wanted to kind of debunk what many of the volunteers have been told over the years, is that he wasn't welcome back. Apparently, according to family members who were living years ago, said no, that was not the case. This is an article, though. It's interesting how, people's arrivals and departures make it into the newspaper back in the early days. It says Mr. J.W. Webb left this week for California. We're sorry to lose him, but he thinks there's a fortune for him in the new departure. So this is April of 1890, reported in the Manatee River Journal. And here again, the same photograph that we saw earlier, but just to remind everyone that this started out as a house, and then it became the dormitory in the post office in 1890 when they moved out to California. And this is a little drawing that I made based upon a description of how it was inside. The staircase went exactly the opposite of the way it does today. In other words, in the 1930s, when the Palmers were redoing the house, they switched up the orientation of the staircase. You have the little porch out front. You got the little porch above a cistern in the back. And that may have been in the center of the building, or it may have been offset a little bit to the right-hand side. This was the kitchen for the original home. And in 1890, the kitchen was removed, and this became another room that was available for rent. So, and then in 1896, again, John Webb added on the little sitting room over here, and then added on the little porch out front. So this is John Webb and his second wife, Emily. In 1884, his first wife, Eliza, had passed away, and he married her sister, Emily, who had come down with the family years before for the original homestead, had gone back to New York, and John Webb convinced her to come back down and marry him, and they ran the resort. And the story goes that she was much more organized than he was, and that she really helped to keep things going at the resort, keep everything organized. We see after she got involved, more and more use of the registration book for the guests and things like that. But this is actually them at the original homestead house with the little puppy there on the rocking chair. And then this is one of my favorite photographs of White Cottage, because this shows the resort guests there at what they called the dormitory. And you see they're right on the porch, like where the L porch is now, off of the sitting room, and you see the primary part of the building behind to the right. And you've got, of course, men and ladies and two dogs in the picture, and most of the men are wearing hats. And I would give anything to know what these two ladies on the left are talking about, because there is some kind of story going on there, and we will never know. But this just kind of shows the somewhat joyful and the way people felt when they were on the property. They came from the cold north down to this tropical paradise to enjoy time, whether they were visiting scientists or Smithsonian, people here for their health, or just people here to go fishing and hunting. Everybody seemed to have a positive experience there. They would take trips, along the shoreline and have little picnics. And this is kind of a cool shot where they're wearing safari hats. And you see they have a lovely picnic basket there with all kind of good things to eat. Everybody, of course, is dressed pretty heavily because it's the winter time, let's face it. So this is one of the photos. This is another photograph, and this one's kind of interesting. Again, everybody's wearing a hat to keep the sun off, and the ladies are all dressed up in their fine clothing. And there's a gentleman sitting here on the ground, but he's got his arm up on what looks to be an old buggy seat there. And it looks like there's another buggy seat maybe in the back of the image. But these were the photographs that were taken of the guests out exploring nature. This is another photograph, and this one is small sailboat with guests, and Frank Guptill standing on the left, and Lizzie Guptill, his bride, on his left, actually holding the spar for the sail. And this is actually on a sandbar out from the Guptill house, and you're looking back at Spanish Point. You're looking back at the point itself, and and then in the far background over here, you're basically looking at Casey Key, and you see they've stabbed this branch into the sandbar and kind of tied off the boat. And might have been an interesting thing to do. Go out to the sandbar, see what kind of shells you can find. Are there any clams out there? And it's a low tide day, so they were exploring the sandbar out there. And then this is another picnic image. And this one's actually on the north end of Casey Key, looking due east. And so you're actually looking at Little Sarasota Pass, which was the original pass that provided access from the bay to the Gulf. And you see the bluff of sand on the south end of Siesta Key. This is the itty bitty southern tip of Siesta Key as it overlapped the northern end of Casey Key. And you see everyone out here enjoying a picnic. And that's John Webb standing on the left with the white captain's hat, and probably proud of having all these visitors come out and enjoy this beautiful place. And then if you look real close down below, it appears to me that this one gal is using these tongs to feed this other guy what looks to be an olive. And they've got these little jars. They must have been jars full of olives, and she's going to feed him one. So that probably would have been quite a treat to have olives down here, but some of these folks might have brought some of their own provisions. And over time, more and more things were available down in this area. And then this is a photograph of the very skimpy bathing suits that they wore when they went what was called surf bathing. And that was a popular thing to do at the resort as well. So here's some of the young people getting ready to go swimming, and then some of the older guys just hanging out fishing. Again, John Webb on the far right, his son Will Webb up on the upper left. And these guys are all sitting on top of the roof of Magic, the powerboat. And Will Webb was the captain. And if you look close, you can kind of see that nice curved roof. And I think it's kind of funny. I think for years, everybody thought they were just on a porch rail or something like that, but they're actually sitting on Magic. And as the time went on, more and more people came to the resort. Once Jack and Emma's house became available as the dormitory, that certainly enhanced capacity at the resort. So here's one of the guest registry pages from 1895. Again, Mr. Dutton is like the first arrival every year. Although what's interesting is in his first years, he reported he was from Philadelphia. Now he's showing as from New York. Remember, this is the gentleman who had designed the plans for Mary's Chapel and had taken Mary out canoeing and out into the bay and things like that. And then you see folks from Minneapolis, from Rochester, New York, St. Paul, Pittsburgh, again, Norman Spang, and perhaps Norman's brother Fred down there from Pittsburgh, and other folks from New York. So, many, many different places people came from to enjoy the resort. So I just kind of wanted to summarize a little bit of the evolution of the Webb's Winter Resort. It started in 1868 with Ezekiel Jewett coming down and said he's going to stay for a week, and he stayed for 3 months. While he was here, he collected 160 species of shells. In 1872, we know that the room and board was between $8 and $10 per week. And then in 1875 is kind of interesting because at this point, they're actually doing it by the month, and it's actually cheaper, $35 a month. And you got your room, your board, wood for the fireplace, and your laundry done. And just to put it in perspective, that would be $1,000 today, approximately $1,000. In 1880, they had between 10 and 15 guests, and this would have been at the original homestead house and the little annex directly adjacent. By 1890, they had 20 to 25 guests, and this would have been the annex and the dormitory. And then by 1900 and some of the years after, they had as many as 30 plus guests. But remember, too, after 1901, there was the upstairs of the Guptill House. It was also available for renting rooms. So that was really the resort just kept growing and growing and growing. And you might recall from the program that we did on the Packing House that as the business at the resort grew, the significance of the income from the farm declined right about the time when all the East Coast growers were now competing with the Webbs for the market down in Key West. So everything worked out really well for them. And the average stay was 3 weeks to 3 months, with most people departing in April or May, similar to what occurs with our snowbirds today. And 1910 was really the last year of the 20 seasons that the resort ran, as the John Webb had passed away in 1908, as well as Emily, and the family was selling all the property to Bertha Palmer. So again, 1907, another, guest register. This is right before John Webb passes away. You got people from Philadelphia, from Michigan, from all over the place, Louisville, Kentucky. And so one of the great things is that Jack and Emma's house or the dormitory provided a place to take photographs. And so we have this photograph of the homestead that we otherwise wouldn't have, because this gave them that aerial platform to take the photo. And then just a little close-up shot of that, because this is really, really a nice photograph. And then looking north, a photograph of the footbridge and also the Guptill House, which I've marked with a green arrow up here. You can see the Guptill House through the woods. And then the Guptill Boatyard, which here has no roof. This photograph was taken probably right after the 1910 hurricane, which was kind of hard on Osprey. And so the roof is gone, and you'll see damage on the footbridge too, probably from that hurricane. And then this is Guptill's dock with the warehouse out on it. And anyway, so we wouldn't have this photograph had it not been for the dormitory being there and the fact you could climb up on the roof and take a photo. And then this one looking down to the south at the Packing House. Again, this is the most iconic photograph we have of the Packing House. Again, taken either from the porch on White Cottage or the roof itself. And so it's nice to have that. And then just to wrap up this section, these two, a happy couple, visitors from who knows where, staying here at the winter resort and taking in everything that it had to offer. So I think at that point, we'll stop the screen sharing and we'll see if Amanda has any questions from any of you. And I will be happy to try to see if I can answer those questions.
All right. So, who lived there in the 1930s?
Well, in the 1930s, it was Potter Palmer Jr. and other family members. And so that was kind of another heyday for White Cottage and what we now call our Spanish Point campus. And so it would have all been Palmer family members and guests of theirs as well.
Are the wood floors in the White Cottage original?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that the only floors that might possibly be original are in the side room, the old John Webb sitting room, the room that has the fireplace and leads back to the sunroom. I think those might be original floors from 1896. The floor in the main room we actually installed about 5 years ago when we were prepping for the cafe, and that's like 100-year-old wood, and it matches the other wood perfectly, but it's not original to the building. And then upstairs, I think most of the wood floors upstairs might be from as late as the 1950s remodel that occurred. So I think the only chance of original wood floor is over in that side room. And I have a photograph of that later.
Okay. How long did visitors stay?
Well, like I was saying, they stayed anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months. And much like people that visit the area today, they'll come down for a couple of weeks on a short vacation or they'll stay the whole season. So some things haven't changed.
Who actually constructed the building in 1885?
Oh, that's a great question. So Will Webb was a skilled carpenter. Frank Gupta was on site. Jack Webb was also skilled. So I think probably between the three of them, they were the primary constructors, and they may have gotten help from other people in the area. But remember, there weren't a whole lot of other people to call on back in 1884 and 1885. So they were pretty much on their own.
All right, and it looks like we have one more. What happened to the docks in the old photo?
Yeah, so I think that the 1910 hurricane probably severely damaged the docks that extended from the point. Newspaper accounts from the time talk about it wiping out docks and boathouses and things like that. And if the 1910 hurricane didn't get it, certainly the 1921 hurricane did, because that was one of the biggest ones to hit that area. So because they don't show up in documentation from later years. So I think either 1910 or 1921.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's go back to sharing that screen. We'll see if we can. All right, so I need to get back to where I was. All right, so now let's talk about the Palmer era. And I got to pick up the pace a little bit because the pace picked up at this point. You got Bertha Palmer coming to town. And all right, all right. You got Bertha Palmer coming to town, and this is how they reported it in the newspapers back in Chicago. Miss Palmer lives in a shack. Chicago social leader will spend Christmas in Florida estate, and it goes on to talk about her 5-room house, which they're calling the shack. This was not White Cottage. This was what would become the Oaks north of the campus property. But anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. Here's the shack, and this was an old hunting lodge, fishing lodge that her aunt had purchased and then presented to her. And it was really the first property that she bought there in the area. And this is Bertha Palmer out front with her brother AC Honore, kind of surveying the site within the first couple of months of her ownership. And then this is what that house ultimately grew into. And we talked about this a lot during our program about Bertha Palmer's Gardens. And that's up on the YouTube. If people want to go back and look for that one, they'll learn all about this. But over on the point next to the old dormitory, they were building sunken garden and pergola, which Bertha said was her favorite garden. She designed it herself. She had help from architect Thomas Reed Martin, who she brought down from Chicago to help design the pergola itself. And the little article here talks about a large force of men constantly at work making improvements in and around the winter home. And it's just a little bit beyond anything that has ever been attempted in Florida. And that's really true because you think about a lot of these big estates that Florida is famous for, whether it's Vizcaya or Catazan or others, those were all the 1920s. This is 1911, 1912 when she's doing all this. In fact, it's 1912 that the pergola is built. And this photograph, also from the top of what she's now calling White Cottage, is looking down and it's showing the old homestead house appears to be gone. But the little annex, she actually labeled as Webb's Tavern and kept that in place. And then you can see the tops of the columns for the pergola prior to the wood being installed. So this is like a snapshot view. And it's after the columns are put up and probably within weeks of that before the top was put on. And then you can see one of the planter urns down here, kind of in the center. And you can see the amount of growth, the natural native vegetation that was on the point and that really occupied what we now call White Cottage lawn. And we're going to see the evolution of that here in the next couple of minutes. You can also see the forms for the concrete seawall that she installed all the way around the point. You can see those here. So it's kind of a neat little photograph. And oh, this is just to point out to you, if you were having a hard time finding the columns, these are the tops of the columns right here. This is one of the urns. And then this, of course, is Sunken Garden and Pergola that she was most proud of, and she would entertain folks with high tea. And then this is a little article about Mr. Bateman. So Mr. Bateman was the manager of the home farm, which was the farm on the property to the north and kind of east of what's now the Spanish Point campus. And he's actually who lived in White Cottage in these early days. In later days, in the later 19s, it would also serve as a guest house for Bertha Palmer. She called it White Cottage. She called the Guptill House the Hill Cottage because it was up on the hill. And maybe she called the White Cottage because it was painted white. She may have called it White Cottage because the Columbian Exposition that she had been so much involved in back in 1893, the World's Fair in Chicago, was called the White City. But in any case, it came to be known as White Cottage while she was there. And then in the 1930s, there was a huge Palmer family kind of revival on the property. Potter Palmer Jr. and Honore Palmer were spending more time in Sarasota. They established the Palmer Bank downtown when all the other banks were closing because of the Great Depression. The Palmers opened a bank. And you can see on this early planning document again, this was at the time when Point Cottage was constructed, either 1930 or 1931. And this was constructed as a guest house for another larger house that they anticipated building, but they never built it. And then they built Acorn Cottage for their help at the main house here, what we now call White Cottage. So Acorn was to support White Cottage, and Point Cottage was to support a building that was never constructed. But this was an attempt to kind of reestablish this property as a family compound for the Palmer family, Potter Palmer Jr. and Honore Palmer and their children. And so this was another heyday for the property. And then again, just kind of reminding you what was kind of constructed when, but you can imagine the construction of Acorn Cottage, Point Cottage, all this stuff. It was hustling and bustling. And this was at a time when there weren't a lot of buildings being built in Sarasota. So this would have been a nice little economic infusion into the area. But in the late 1930s and 1940s, it appears the site was tremendously neglected. I'm sure the family came for little vacations and things like that. But this is a photograph from 1948, and we're looking at White Cottage, and we're looking at White Cottage lawn, and things do appear to be somewhat grown over. And then these are some shots from the same time period. This is the shoreline of that White Cottage area. And you see the remains of the old seawall that had been destroyed by numerous storms out here. So you can still see a signature for that at low tide when you look down into the water. This shot basically of the White Cottage from across the bay from the site of the packing house. And in the foreground, you're seeing the original pilings for the packing house, which was long gone at this point, but you're looking over toward the White Cottage here, and you see it with all of its enlargements and enhancements. And then Gordon Palmer came to town. This is Potter Palmer Jr.'s son, grandson of Bertha Palmer. He was a Harvard grad from 1936. He was in the U.S. Navy as a lieutenant commander. And in 1946, when he got out of the Navy, he married Janice Hardage, who had grown up in Atlanta. And they moved to Chicago and then quickly came down to Sarasota. And he kind of found the old family estate needing help and needing to be revitalized. And he was the one who was kind of behind the notion of restoring everything and opening it back up to the public in honor of his grandmother, Bertha Palmer. His job down here was to serve as director of the Palmer Bank and Trust. He organized the Palmer nurseries on the property out toward 41. He restored his grandmother's home, the Oaks and the gardens, and opened the site to the tours. As I said, unfortunately, he died quite young in 1964. And that was kind of the end of the Oaks property, as it was called, being open to the public. And here's Gordon out on one of the trails with one of these graceful live oak trees just filled with epiphytes. You see the resurrection ferns. I'm sure there's some butterfly orchids on there. He had one little walkway he called the Orchid Trail. And then this is his wife, Janice, outside the White Cottage. This is the early 1950s. You see it's all painted up nice at this point. They did a tremendous amount of work on the building to get it into shape for their home. And I just wanted to show the old photograph here so you can kind of contrast. There's still 4 columns out front, but they're much larger, spaced out wider. You can see how the current porch is twice as deep as the original one was, and it kind of gives you a sense of that change over time. And then this is from 1951. This is a photograph by Joe Steinmetz, who was one of the preeminent photographers in the Sarasota area, and many of his photographs have been preserved both at the Florida archives as well as in local collections. And so this is showing White Cottage looking a little bit more like we are used to seeing it today, where some of the vegetation has been cleared from the lawn, although there's still quite a few more trees there than there are today. You see both gumbo limbos on the left-hand side, some unidentified trees, and then you see some cedar trees there. And you see a nice shell walkway along the shoreline and that hedge that's still there, kind of along the water's edge. You know, some things haven't changed very much. And then this is a wonderful photograph inside what we call the square porch. So this is the entrance now to the cafe, the primary entrance. And you see they have it set up with the popular furniture of the day, the cane furniture and comfortable cushions. You see the Life magazines there and the little coffee table that also has the little holder for the magazines. And you see some of Gordon and Janice's Siamese cats. So the question is, how many cats do you see? Well, folks, there are 4 Seal Point Siamese cats in this photograph. So that I think that's pretty cool. I originally only saw 2, then I saw a third, then I saw the fourth one being sitting on the chair in the back there. And then these are some amazing photographs that were taken by Richard Nelson, who was an attorney in Sarasota. And this is an abstract view because it's showing this little atrium that they constructed between what we call the square porch and the L porch. And it has a stone base and then these glass walls. And so this was like a little glass house, a little greenhouse, if you will, um, which is kind of cool. And this is an inside view looking out through that greenhouse on the left-hand side. And it kind of brought some of that outdoors in and also served as a nice little place for decorative plants and also gave a little bit of privacy from the big exposed view out to the bay. And then this is a photograph looking towards White Cottage Lawn and the yellow arrows pointing toward what remained of the columns of the original pergola. And so again, you see a lot more vegetation there on the lawn than what you see today. You see a royal palm over here kind of toward the middle. That's kind of a juvenile royal palm at this point. We'll see some other photographs of that later on. See some nice red cedars up here. You see that the Italian cypress that she planted to be low shrubs in the garden have soared high like Italian cypress like to do. And then over here on the far left, you see a little mahogany sapling. And that's the big mahogany tree that's still out there today. So little close-up views of that. This is the mahogany sapling on the far left. And that's the big tree right at the cafe that hangs out over the water. And the ospreys sit up there and eat their lunch while the people are having lunch at the cafe. And then we're going to move to the right here. Again, you're seeing that royal palm there and some other nice vegetation. And then over here, you see the columns and back and the Italian cypress. So it's just kind of interesting to see how things have changed over the years. This is on the south side where we have the shell path now. It's all grown in with grass. So, it'd be impossible to do that today. There's too much foot traffic. But back then, it was just a home for Gordon and Janice. And so they were able to maintain it as grass. And about a year ago, we were visited by a family who had actually lived in the home in the 1970s. They were related to the gentleman who was involved in making plans for the development of the Oaks as a residential subdivision. And he was friends with the Palmer family and helped to negotiate the donation of the property. And anyway, they had some family photographs that they shared with me, and I wanted to include them because this just shows 2 of their daughters and their little puppy dog out there on that grass path just outside the square porch there. leading to what we now have as a cafe. And then this was kind of cool. Their swing set up on the White Cottage lawn, beautiful view of the bay to the north. And you can see the columns from the pergola to the far left in the background. But they had quite an elaborate setup here with a jungle gym over here and the swing set over here. And in 1970s, they commissioned local artist Frank Hopper to do this image of the children and their dog out on the remains of the pergola. And this is kind of the pergola the way I remember it back in 1979. It was just a bunch of broken columns. But this is an amazing image. And if you look up at the top, you can see the Palmer boat dock in the background and what looks like mountains, but they're really just mangroves. All right, so real quick, we're going to wrap up today. The property was listed on the National Register in 1975. This resulted from the efforts of the Junior League of Sarasota, working with local historian Janet Snyder Matthews that prepared the application for the National Register. And this is a little event that they held a year later at the site right there at the Sunken Garden and Pergola. And again, you can see the condition of the pergola at the time. And this is basically what White Cottage looked like around the time of the donation of the property. So it had not been well maintained in the late 70s and early 80s, and so it needed some work. And here's one of the proud volunteers, Marion Eakins, pointing out the nicely refurbished White Cottage. And you see a car parked in the carport. This is before they put the extra columns in there. If you look down the path, you see the little royal palm has grown into quite a tall royal palm, and a lot of that vegetation is still out on the White Cottage lawn. Here's another view from that same time period. This old color photograph, same time period. Little bit of renovation work done just to kind of spiff things up. But and then here again, showing the carport without the columns going down the middle. And then in 2000, Siebert Architects and Ball Construction conducted a tremendous renovation of the property, taking off all the old rotten wood, fixing the roof, doing all kinds of stuff. This is project manager Ed Norman and surveying the damage up there. I mean, it's interesting. The solid pine rafters are still intact, but the roof itself had pretty much collapsed at this point. You see the brackets for the round copper gutters and things like that. And this is just over the little sunroom in the back. So again, this was added in the 1930s and it already needed to be redone 70 years later. This is upstairs in the bride's room, again, taking out all the rotten wood. And here you can see the original doorway that I pointed out on the earlier photograph. And then this is actually where my office is today, looking into the bride's room. So they had quite a bit of work to do. And this all was completed in 2002. Here's the little newsletter that announced the reopening. And they had offices upstairs. And actually by 2002, the offices were not upstairs. They were up at the schoolhouse. And they used upstairs for archive room and volunteer room and things like that. So real quick, just to go over some dates. The original house constructed 1884, 1885, and then becoming the dormitory for the resort in 1890. Additions by John Webb in 1896. Of course, Bertha Palmer purchases 1910, 1911. Potter Palmer comes on the scene in the 1930s and really spices it up. And then 1946, Gordon and his wife Janice are down there, lived there for 2 decades. And then, of course, in 1980, the site donated for preservation and education, which we still do every day. And 2000 to 2002, the White College rehab. So here's one of the rooms of the cafe. This is the one floor that might be original. And of course, just a nice place to sit and enjoy your meal, look out at the bay, little sunroom in the back. And then in the main room, we've got these nice displays that we put in there. And it features the history of Selby Gardens, downtown campus and Spanish Point campus, and then also features both the Webb era and the Palmer area there at White Cottage. So you see some of the same photographs that we've looked at today in the program. There are 2 places in the building where you can kind of see original construction stuff. The one above the staircase is the original Webb staircase, that went one way, and then the Palmers came and made it another way. And then upstairs in the bride room, there's just one piece of plexiglass that covers up the original wall board, so you can see the original material up there. And then I wanted to take you down into the basement and show you what a foundation looks like for an 1885 building. These are hand-hewn, solid as a rock, 8 by 8 inch pine beams. And this is what's holding up the whole building. And then here, these are pine roof floor joists, and these are supporting the floor. And it looks like the centerpiece here was Webb era, and it looks like the Palmers added on pieces on each side and kind of beefed that up. for more weight capacity. But look at the condition of this wood. It's almost like it's brand new. You know, it's just amazing. This old heart pine just seems to last forever. And then this is the concrete block foundation that the Palmers put under the building, I believe in the 1930s. The reason why I say that is because some of these blocks are typical of late 1920s, early 1930s construction. This is the shell mound underneath the building. This is when you're in the basement and you look where all the ductwork and the plumbing is. This is just the shell mound. It's just amazing. The building's preserved the shell mound underneath it. And then some of the people we've talked about today, obviously the Webb family, Jack and Emma, who built the house, Bertha Palmer, her children. Joe Lovingood got involved in the 1950s. He was working for Gordon Palmer, did most of the renovation back in the 1950s. He ultimately went on to have a stone yard in Sarasota, sold brick and stone, and was probably the first person to really do that in the modern era. Janet Snyder Matthews was so influential in gathering up the history, writing up the National Register status, and then again, Ball Construction and Siebert Architects involved in the remodeling. And so, this wraps it up. We're a couple minutes over, but I think we'll take a couple questions if you have them. And once again, want to thank everybody for being with us today to learn a little bit more about White Cottage. And as you can see, it's got quite the history.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions.
All
So,
right.
who donated the building? Was the property donated at the same time?
Yeah, so the Palmer family donated the property at the same time that the development order was approved for the residential neighborhood called the Oaks, which is to our north. So that all happened. The lead up to it was the late 1970s. It happened in 1980, and it was set aside basically as a place to educate people and children about history and nature, which is what we do there every day today.
Did Bertha Palmer stay in White Cottage?
Wow, that's a great question. I've often wondered if she ever stayed there. You know, might she have come over and stayed there a little bit while the enhancements were taking place at the Oaks, or did those enhancements take place while she was out of town? I don't know. But she certainly didn't live there as a home. If she stayed there a couple of nights while they were working on things, that's a possibility. But again, primarily her site manager lived there, and then other guests that would come down from Chicago.
And then why did Bertha Palmer call it White Cottage?
Well, yeah. So I talked about that earlier a little bit. Maybe it was just because she had such simple names that she was applying to the existing structures on site. So, you know, she called Webb's old house the Tavern, and she called the Guptill house the Hill Cottage because it's up on the hill. She liked this idea of these cottages. And then so it was painted white. Maybe she just called it White Cottage, or maybe it harkened back to that great white city that the Columbian Exposition was back in Chicago that she had been so much a part of. It was funny for a long time. There was a white family that used to stay there. Their last name was White, and they were there all the time during the Webb's Winter Resort. Maybe it was even named for them. I don't know. Those are three possibilities, but she's the one who named it that.
All right. Okay, one more question and then we can be done. So how many guests could the White Cottage accommodate?
Yeah, so if you figure you had four rooms upstairs, so then you could have had eight people upstairs, and you probably had at least two rooms downstairs. So maybe as many as a dozen people. And then it would have been kind of comfortable. You had the sitting room off to the side. You would have had another little living room, a couple little living rooms. For all I know, they used all eight rooms. That could have been even more. But we certainly can see in the guest registry how the capacity changed over time. And while it might not have been a happy day when Jack left the family and moved to California, it certainly opened up a lot of guest space to make more money at the resort. So it was a big part of that success.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. We are out of questions. And this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel, Selby Gardens. Just search that, probably by later on this afternoon.
Thanks again, Amanda, and thanks for everybody for joining us. And come back next month. We're going to talk about the gems and the jewels, all the little things we haven't talked about so far. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.